In the winter of 1944, a young American GI named Private James Henderson sat in a frozen foxhole somewhere in the Ardennes forest of Belgium. The temperature had dropped to minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit. Artillery shells screamed overhead. His fingers were so numb he could barely feel them, but in his hands he held something that would prove more strategically valuable than any weapon in his arsenal, a small olive-drab can. What Private Henderson didn't know, as he struggled to open that can with frozen fingers, was that he was holding a piece of technology that military historians would later credit with helping to win the Second World War. Not a bomb, not a tank, not even a rifle, a can of food. Today we're going to explore one of the most overlooked factors that determined victory in World War II, the humble American military ration. This is a story about logistics, innovation, and the unglamorous truth that wars are won as much by supply chains as by soldiers. To understand why the American ration was revolutionary, we need to go back to 1941, when the United States military faced a problem that no army in history had ever confronted on such a scale. The United States was about to fight a war on multiple continents simultaneously. American troops would need to operate in the frozen tundra of Alaska, the sweltering jungles of the South Pacific, the deserts of North Africa, and the forests of Europe, all at the same time. And every single one of those soldiers would need to eat 3 meals a day, every day, sometimes thousands of miles from the nearest supply base. Let me give you some numbers that illustrate the magnitude of this challenge. By 1945, the United States had more than 12 million men and women in uniform scattered across every corner of the globe. The distance from San Francisco to Manila is approximately 6,000 miles. From New York to North Africa, it's nearly 4,000 miles. And every can of food, every piece of chocolate, every packet of coffee had to travel those distances. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who commanded Allied forces in Europe, would later write in his memoirs, "The battle is won or lost before it is ever fought. It's won in the supply depots and shipping lanes." He understood something that historians often overlook when they focus on dramatic battles and heroic charges. Logistics wins wars. But in 1941, the American military had a serious problem. The standard US Army field ration, known as the reserve ration, was designed in 1907. Let me repeat that, 1907. It consisted of canned meat, hard bread, and coffee. The cans were heavy, bulky, and difficult to open under combat conditions. The bread often arrived mouldy. The entire package weighed nearly 5 pounds. Imagine being a soldier in the Pacific Theatre. You're carrying a rifle, ammunition, a water canteen, grenades, entrenching tools, and all your other gear. Now add 5 pounds of food cans for just 1 day. Multiply that by however long your unit will be away from resupply. The weight alone was unsustainable. But the weight was only part of the problem. The bigger issue was nutrition. Soldiers engaged in combat burn an enormous number of calories. Estimates from military nutritionists at the time suggested between 4,500 and 5,000 calories per day. The old reserve ration provided barely 3,000 calories and lacked essential vitamins. Troops were literally starving even while they had food to eat. Colonel Roland Isker, who served as chief of the Subsistence Research Laboratory at the time, though some records list his role with slight variations in dates, later recalled in a 1965 interview, "We were sending boys to fight with Civil War-era food. It was a scandal waiting to happen, and it did happen in the worst possible way." The real wake-up call came during the Battle of Bataan in the Philippines, from January to April 1942. American and Filipino forces, under the command of General Douglas MacArthur, found themselves cut off on the Bataan Peninsula. The Japanese had quickly overrun most of the Philippines, and these trapped forces, approximately 76,000 men, were running desperately low on supplies. What followed was a catastrophe that had as much to do with nutrition as with combat. The soldiers on Bataan were reduced to quarter rations, then half rations, then almost nothing. Private Leon Beck, who survived the subsequent Bataan Death March, wrote in his diary, "We weren't beaten by Japanese bullets. We were beaten by hunger. Men who should have been able to march 20 miles couldn't walk 200 yards. Not because they lacked courage, but because they lacked calories." By the time Bataan fell on April 9, 1942, medical reports indicated that the average American soldier had lost 35 pounds. Many were suffering from beriberi, scurvy, and other vitamin deficiency diseases. When the forced march began, what would become known as the Bataan Death March, Thousands of men simply didn't have the physical reserves to survive it. Approximately 2,500 to 10,000 Filipino and 100 to 650 American prisoners of war died during that march. The military leadership in Washington received these reports with horror. Secretary of War Henry Stimson convened an emergency meeting of the Quartermaster Corps. The message was clear. American soldiers would never again go into battle without adequate nutrition. The United States had the industrial capacity to feed its troops properly. Failure to do so wasn't just a logistics problem, it was a moral failure. But here's where the story gets interesting, because the solution didn't come from generals or politicians. It came from an unlikely source, scientists working in a laboratory in Chicago. The Subsistence Research Laboratory, established at the request of the War Department, brought together nutritionists, food scientists, engineers, and even behavioral psychologists. Their mission was audacious: design a complete meal that could be carried in a soldier's pocket, wouldn't spoil in any climate, provided complete nutrition, and actually tasted good enough that soldiers would want to eat it. Dr. Ansel Keys, yes, the same man who would later become famous for the Mediterranean diet, led the team developing what would become the K-ration. In his notes from 1942, Dr. Keys wrote, "We are not designing a product, we are designing a weapon. Every calorie we put in that box is a bullet against the enemy." The challenge was immense. Food that doesn't spoil typically doesn't taste good. Food that's nutritious is often heavy. Food that's lightweight usually lacks calories. They needed to square this circle, and they needed to do it fast. The team worked 18-hour days, 7 days a week. They tested hundreds of combinations. They exposed prototype rations to extreme heat in ovens and extreme cold in freezers. They dropped them from heights to simulate rough handling during transport. They even had soldiers taste test them under simulated combat conditions, sleep-deprived, stressed, and exhausted. By late 1942, the American military had rolled out 3 revolutionary new ration systems: the K-ration, the C-Ration, and the D-Ration. Each served a specific purpose, and together they formed a system that gave American forces an enormous advantage. Let me walk you through what made these rations special, because the details matter. The K-Ration was designed for paratroopers and other soldiers who needed maximum nutrition in minimum space. It came in a waxed cardboard box about the size of a Cracker Jack box, small enough to fit in a cargo pocket. Inside were 3 meal units: breakfast, dinner, and supper. Each unit contained around 1,200 calories. But here's the genius part. The K-Ration wasn't just about calories. The breakfast unit contained a canned meat product, biscuits, a fruit bar, instant coffee, sugar tablets, and chewing gum. The dinner unit had cheese, biscuits, a powdered drink mix, sugar, and cigarettes. The supper unit contained another meat product, biscuits, a chocolate bar, and toilet paper. Now you might wonder why cigarettes and chewing gum were considered essential. The answer reveals how deeply the designers understood human psychology under stress. Smoking and chewing gum helped soldiers stay alert and gave them something to do during the endless periods of waiting that characterize combat. The psychological benefit was deemed as important as the nutritional content. The C-Ration was heavier but more varied. It came in 6 can units and was designed for situations where troops had more carrying capacity but still needed portable food. The meat units included items like meat and beans, meat and vegetable hash, and meat and spaghetti. Each can was lined with a special coating to prevent the metal from reacting with the food, a small detail that made an enormous difference in taste and shelf life. The D-Ration was perhaps the most innovative. It was an emergency chocolate bar, but not like any chocolate you've ever tasted. The specifications were bizarre. It had to remain solid at 120 degrees Fahrenheit, provide 600 calories, taste just a little better than a boiled potato. That's an actual quote from the specifications. And be difficult to bite into so soldiers wouldn't be tempted to eat it except in emergencies. Captain Paul Logan, an officer in the 101st Airborne Division, wrote in a letter home in 1944, "That D-bar tastes like sweetened chalk, but I've never been so grateful for anything in my life. Saved it 3 days in Belgium before I finally needed it. When I did, it was the difference between having the energy to dig a foxhole and freezing to death." But the real innovation wasn't the individual rations. It was the system behind them. The United States created the most sophisticated food supply chain in human history. Let me give you an example of how this worked. When the Allies invaded Normandy on June 6, 1944, D-Day, The initial assault force was approximately 156,000 men. Within 3 weeks, over 1 million Allied soldiers would be in France. Every single one of them needed 3 meals a day. That's 3 million meals per day. The logistics are staggering. Ships carrying rations left ports on the American East Coast and travelled across the submarine-infested Atlantic. The cans were loaded onto landing craft, brought ashore across the heavily defended beaches, transferred to trucks, and distributed to units, some of which were still under fire. And it worked. Despite all the chaos of combat, despite the German resistance, despite the destruction of much of France's infrastructure, American soldiers in Normandy ate regularly. General Omar Bradley, who commanded American ground forces in Normandy, later wrote, "My greatest fear before D-Day wasn't German tanks or beach defences, it was logistics. If we couldn't feed our troops, we couldn't advance. The Germans understood this, that's why they fought so hard to disrupt our supply lines. But our supply system proved unbreakable." Compare this to the German and Japanese situations. By 1944, German soldiers on the Eastern Front were often reduced to eating whatever they could scavenge. German military records from late 1944 show units receiving only one hot meal every 2 or 3 days. Japanese soldiers in the Pacific were in even worse shape. On islands like Guadalcanal and New Guinea, Japanese forces literally starved to death by the thousands. Disease and malnutrition killed more Japanese soldiers than American bullets did. This wasn't because the Germans and Japanese were less capable at logistics. It was because they didn't have the industrial capacity and geographic advantages that America possessed. The United States was the only major combatant that didn't have to worry about enemy bombing of its factories or submarines sinking supply ships in its coastal waters. But let's move beyond statistics and strategy. Let's talk about what these rations meant to the individual soldiers who carried them. I want to share with you a story from the personal diary of Sergeant Ralph Jenkins, who served with the 2nd Infantry Division in the Battle of the Bulge. His unit was surrounded in the small Belgian town of St. Vith in December 1944. The temperatures dropped below zero. German forces had them cut off from resupply. They were under constant artillery bombardment. Jenkins wrote, "December 21st, 1944, 6th day surrounded. We're almost out of ammunition. I've got 2 K-rations left. The younger guys are terrified, and I don't blame them. But here's the thing, we're not starving. Even trapped behind enemy lines, even with everything going to hell, we've got food. I watched Private Morrison share his last chocolate bar with a wounded guy this morning. That sounds like a small thing, maybe sentimental, but I've seen what happens when men get hungry enough. They stop being a unit. They stop looking out for each other. That chocolate bar was worth more than a medal." The unit held St. Vith for 6 days before finally retreating on December 23rd. Military historians credit their resistance with buying crucial time for Allied forces to regroup. Without adequate nutrition, it's doubtful they could have held out even half that long. Here's another dimension to consider: the psychological impact of knowing you would be fed. Combat is terrifying. That's a truth that transcends any individual battle or war. Soldiers face circumstances that most civilians cannot imagine. In that context, small certainties become enormously important. Lieutenant Robert Leckie, who fought in the Pacific Theatre and later wrote several acclaimed books about his experiences, described it this way: "You never knew if you'd survive the next hour. You didn't know if that jungle trail was mined, if that ridgeline had Japanese machine guns, if the next mortar round had your name on it, but you absolutely knew, that at some point in the day you'd get your rations. In a world of chaos and death, that was something solid to hold on to." The rations also created unexpected moments of humanity. There are countless stories of American soldiers sharing their rations with starving civilians in Europe and Asia. After the liberation of concentration camps, American military rations were often the first real food survivors had eaten in months or even years. Medical officers had to carefully control distribution, because the prisoners' bodies couldn't handle sudden rich food. But those K-rations, with their carefully balanced nutrition, proved ideal for gradually rebuilding strength. Sergeant Leonard Burney, who helped liberate Dachau concentration camp in April 1945, wrote, "I'd been carrying around a couple K-rations for 2 days. When we opened those camp gates and saw what was inside, God, there aren't words for it. These people were skeletons, living skeletons. We started handing out our rations. I watched a man who probably weighed 90 pounds cry while he ate a biscuit. He kept saying thank you in broken English. I'm not a religious man, but in that moment I felt like that little box of food was sacred. But we need to be honest about the limitations and problems too. Because history isn't simple, and these rations weren't perfect. Many soldiers hated the K-rations. They complained the food was monotonous, that the meat products tasted like mystery mush, that eating the same thing day after day was psychologically draining. There's a famous anecdote, possibly apocryphal but widely repeated, about a soldier who said, "The K-ration is the only weapon designed to kill more Americans than Germans." The C-rations had quality control issues. Some cans arrived dented or spoiled. In tropical climates, the heat sometimes caused the cans to swell and burst. The cheese in the K-rations would often turn rancid in high temperatures. And there was a darker side to American abundance. The contrast between well-fed American troops and starving Allied soldiers from other nations sometimes created resentment. Soviet soldiers on the Eastern Front, who often went days without adequate food, looked at their American counterparts' rations with a mixture of admiration and bitterness. Some British soldiers felt that Americans were overfed and over here. Japanese propaganda tried to exploit this, telling their soldiers that the Americans were soft, dependent on luxury, weakened by their comfortable lifestyle. But this propaganda backfired. When Japanese soldiers captured American rations, they were often shocked by the quality and quantity. Some Japanese units' morale collapsed when they realized the enormous material disparity they were fighting against. We have captured Japanese documents from late 1944 where officers worry about this exact problem. One report states, this is a translation, the men discovered American rations among captured supplies. The psychological impact is concerning. They now understand the true industrial capacity of the enemy. So what does all this mean? Why does a story about canned food matter when we're talking about the greatest conflict in human history? I think there are several lessons here that extend far beyond World War II. First, it reminds us that wars aren't won solely by courage and firepower. They're won by the unglamorous work of logistics, planning, and industrial capacity. The United States didn't defeat the Axis powers just because American soldiers were braver. They weren't necessarily. German and Japanese soldiers fought with tremendous courage too. The difference was that American soldiers could sustain that fighting because they were well fed, well supplied, and backed by an industrial system that could outproduce any other nation on Earth. Second, it shows us how innovation in unexpected places can have enormous strategic impact. The scientists designing these rations probably never expected their work to be discussed by historians 75 years later, but their attention to detail, the wax coating on the boxes, the careful balance of nutrients, even the inclusion of cigarettes and chewing gum, these small decisions aggregated into a significant advantage. Third, and perhaps most importantly, it humanizes the war. When we think about World War II, we often focus on the big picture, the movement of armies, the turning points of battles, the decisions of generals and politicians. But the war was also experienced one meal at a time, one cold foxhole at a time, by millions of individual soldiers who were just trying to survive and do their duty. That Private James Henderson I mentioned at the beginning, the one with the can of food in his frozen foxhole in the Ardennes, he survived the Battle of the Bulge. He came home to Minnesota, married his sweetheart, raised 3 children, and worked as an electrician for 40 years. He died in 1998 at the age of 75. His daughter told me, I interviewed her while researching this topic, that her father rarely talked about the war. But he had one habit that she never understood until she was an adult. He never, ever threw away food. Even a single leftover biscuit would be carefully wrapped and saved. When she asked him about it once, he just said, "You don't know what it's like to be hungry, and I hope you never do." That's what those little olive drab cans represented. Not just calories and nutrients, but a promise. A promise that even in the worst circumstances imaginable, even thousands of miles from home, even under artillery fire in a frozen forest, America would take care of its soldiers. And that promise was kept. The next time you see a can of food in your pantry, maybe take a moment to think about this story. Think about the scientists who designed it, the workers who produced it, the sailors who transported it, and the soldiers who carried it into battle. Think about how something so ordinary, so mundane, played a role in shaping the world we live in today. History isn't just about the big moments, it's also about the small things that make those big moments possible. If you found this story interesting, if it made you think about World War II in a different way, please consider subscribing to this channel. I share these forgotten stories because I believe they matter. I believe that understanding how wars were actually fought, not just in dramatic battles, but in the daily struggle to keep soldiers fed, clothed, and equipped, gives us a more honest and complete picture of history. And I'd love to hear from you. Did anyone in your family serve in World War II? Do you remember them talking about the food they ate? Leave a comment below. These stories are precious, and they're disappearing as we lose the generation that lived through this war. Thank you for watching. Remember these stories, remember these people, they earned it.